BBOR Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia at heart and from around the globe. And hello everybody, today is Wednesday, another Ripper Wednesday. Welcome to the show. This year on Wednesdays, I've been talking to you guys about Jack the Ripper, perhaps the world's most famous unsolved murder mystery. And in this episode, I will be discussing the murder of Emily Atkins Horsnall. And Jack the Ripper was a serial killer who operated in England in 1888. Whatever happened before or after that is still part of the mystery, and we're going to see very clearly in this episode that there's a lot of hypothesizing about how Emily Horsnall could be a victim of Jack the Ripper prior to the Autumn of Terror in 1888. She was murdered in 1887, almost 1 year before the murder of Mary Kelly in November of 1888. Emily Atkins Horsnall was murdered in November of 1887, and I was reading through the book Ripper Confidential by Tom Westcott, and it's a book that was recommended to me because supporters of the Ripper hoax theory like Tom Westcott's books, because he talks about a lot of misconceptions in the Jack the Ripper case. But as I was reading through Ripper Confidential, I noticed that he was more or less talking about how he believed certain unconfirmed crimes could be connected to the Ripper, most notably the murder of Emma Smith in the spring of 1888 and the murder of Martha Tabram just prior to Jack the Ripper's reign of terror. But with Emily Atkins Horsnall, again, she's murdered in November of 1888, and the first website that I found that was discussing her case was Jack the Ripper Tour, and it states that she was actually awakened in her lodging house, and she was talking to someone else who lived there and complaining about the pain in her stomach and that she had been beaten severely previously. And I was like, wait a second, she's in the lodging house and talking about a beating? How on earth is this going to tie into Jack the Ripper? And then the innkeeper, the person running the lodging house, even talked about witnessing her being doubled over in agonizing pain. And she actually passed away because of inflammation to the intestines, which most likely resulted from being beaten and kicked to her body. And again, I was just thinking, how on earth is this crime going to be connected to Jack the Ripper? Jack the Ripper mutilated the bodies of women, not just beating them up in the street. I mean, even with the murder of Emma Smith, where there's a very vicious assault that takes place, it's really not like the Ripper's other crimes, because the Ripper disemboweled the women, pulled out their organs, took their organs away from the crime scenes. We're talking about things like the uterus, kidneys, the heart, and just somebody getting beaten up in the streets. I was just thinking, give me your hypothesis, please, and let's look at this with an open mind. How could the murder of Emily Horsnall be connected to Jack the Ripper? And I want to provide the disclaimer that even though this case is widely discussed on a lot of different Jack the Ripper websites, I could not find a photograph or illustration of Emily Horsnall, and I thought that was rather surprising. If anybody can find one, they can send it to me at blackboxonlineradio@aol.com. And I also want to point out that there's an alternative spelling of her name, and that is Horsnail, Horsnail. You might find both of these spellings on various places, in various places. But the way that you can tie this to Jack the Ripper is, Emma Smith was reported to have been beaten up, attacked, maybe even sexually assaulted in the spring of 1888. And by sexually assaulted, I mean penetrated with an object, and she's able to walk back to her home, even though it took her several hours, which people believe she's just been beaten up by multiple attackers and is just kind of staggering home, passing out from the blood loss and so on. Then after that, you have the murder of Martha Tabram that took place, again, in the summer of 1888, but just before the Autumn of Terror. So then you could almost see that there's an escalation in criminal behavior. And with serial killers, not only do they have just this tipping off point where they just break out into murderous rage, and then they just have to keep doing it over and over and over again. Some serial killers start out with a murder that might not even be exactly planned, and then their viciousness escalates, and there can be very long gaps in between the serial killer's activities. When we think about Jack the Ripper, we see things like, the murders are 2 weeks apart, 3 weeks apart, and even 5 weeks apart. between Jack the Ripper's double event on September 30th of 1888 and November 9th of 1888 with the murder of Mary Kelly. There's a 5-week gap, and some people even think that's a bit large. But sometimes a serial killer will have months in between crimes, sometimes years in between crimes. And is it possible that Jack the Ripper started out as part of the gang that would attack women, one of the London street gangs? Is it possible that Jack the Ripper started out as someone who was assaulting women, and then that escalated to viciously assaulting women, and then that escalated to stabbing women, and that escalated to disemboweling the women and mutilating their bodies, and then ultimately to the murder of Mary Kelly, where her body is just absolutely eviscerated and her face is mutilated beyond recognition, her heart is taken out, her intestines are pulled out and left on a table, and that this is someone who definitely and consistently escalated their violent tendencies. Now, again, when I was reading Tom Westcott's book, one point that he makes that I think is an extremely strong point, and that is that the first Whitechapel murder should be viewed as the murder of Emily Atkins Horsnall. This really is the first crime in the Whitechapel murders. I mean, yes, it's within this 12-month cycle going from the murder of Emily Horsnall to the murder of Mary Kelly. Fair enough, she should be included in that. Most people would refer to Emma Smith as the first victim in the Whitechapel murders, but Emily Horsnall should have her place there. And I also have to give a shout out to Victorian Whitechapel. This website has numerous posts about the murder of Emily Horsnall, and there's even like a full biography section, which I will read for you right now, and that is that Emily Atkins Horsnall was born at some time in or between 1860 and 1861, and if you look this up, you will probably find some conflicting information. You'll see different dates about the year that she was born on various different websites. She was born Emily Atkins, and she was married at some time between 1880 and 1884 to Alfred Horsnall and took his last name. She was the mother of at least one child, and her early life is that she was born in Shoreditch, Middlesex, England. She had one sister, and in 1880 she married a cabinet maker named Alfred Horsnall in Bethnal Church in Bethnal Green, East End of London. And this was in the borough of Tower Hamlets. In 1881 they had a daughter called Emily, and they lived at 4 Edward Street in Bethnal Green. By 1886 Alfred was living with another woman named Rachel. And that is totally normal for 1888. When I've been reading all these different stories about the women that are either attacked by Jack the Ripper or included in the Whitechapel murders, they're married and then they're separated from their partner for 7 years and now living with somebody else. So, I mean, that's just absolutely normal for the time period. In March of 1887, Emily was admitted to the Whitechapel Infirmary from 19 George Street with an inflamed foot. The night of Saturday, the 5th of November, 1887, she had been drinking, and she was attacked by some men she didn't know. Note that that says men plural, so that's quite similar to the attack on Emma Smith, where she reported that multiple men attacked her in the spring of 1888. And this is about, roughly 7 months before, 7 months before. By this time, she had been the resident of 19 George Street, a lodging house, for 3 or 4 years since she had separated from her husband. She was around 26 or 27 years old and was said to have acted as a charwoman for a living, and other sources about Emily Atkins Horsnall say that she would more or less just find odd jobs and do whatever she had to do to pay the rent. And the press showed no interest in this case aside from a few paragraphs that were published in Lloyd's Weekly newspaper on November 13th of 1887, the day after the inquest. And the People, 20, was an issue that was put out in 1887. The inquest was held at Weir's Arms Tavern in Baker's Row, which is now 13 Valence Road today, in Whitechapel, and was presided by the East Middlesex coroner, Win Edwin Baxter. Baxter is a great name to have for coroners and doctors, just saying. At the inquest, Coroner Baxter ordered an unnamed police sergeant to make some inquiries, because none had been done. But the police said that they had no leads to follow. And in all seriousness, for 1888, I mean, we're not dealing with things like security cameras. We're not dealing with things like maybe someone took a video on their phone. Just a woman is attacked by multiple men in the street. She just says that she was beaten up, and then She was reported to have made it back to 19 George Street, and she was in bed. She complained of severe pain, doubled over in agonizing pain, and then ultimately that led to her death. And there is an aftermath section here on Victorian Whitechapel that says, although rarely mentioned in connection with the Whitechapel murders, it may be interesting to note that Emily and Atkins Horsnall and Martha Tabram lived at the same lodging house, 19 George Street. Emily and Emma Elizabeth Smith would have been neighbors for more than a year by 1887, the former living at 19 George Street and the latter at 18 George Street. Mary Ann Connolly, who was also known as Pearly Paul, the last person who saw Martha Tabram alive, would have been known to both Emily and Emma Smith, having been neighbors for 18 months and mates with the former for 3 or 4 years. They lived under the same roof. And Rose Milett, a possible Jack the Ripper victim who was murdered on December 20th of 1888, also lived at 18 George Street, the lodging house, and would die in strange circumstances at the age of 29. And Rose Milett is a possible Jack the Ripper victim. This is the stuff that Tom Westcott really wanted to talk about in Ripper Confidential, and I was reading from Victorian Whitechapel, a website here online, but Tom Westcott talks about all of these things in Ripper Confidential in a different way, just saying, what are the coincidences that all of these women are in close proximity, all the women that I've listed off, all the possible Jack the Ripper victims, Martha Tabram, Emma Smith, and then we even have Rose Milett and Emily Horsnall. All of these people are living at 18 George Street, 19 George Street. What are the chances that these things aren't connected? And the honest answer is that at face value, this does not surprise me at all. If you had just shared this information with me about, where the victims lived, and I didn't know anything else about Jack the Ripper, and I didn't know who Jack the Ripper was, and you were just like, okay, there was a set of homicides that took place between 1887 and 1888, and a lot of the women stayed at these two boarding houses at 18 George Street and 19 George Street, I would be like, yeah, I would think there was a connection. But based on the big picture of the Whitechapel murders, I'm not really surprised at all, and why not? This could be a very simple explanation and a skeptical alternative, that there are not necessarily connections among these murders and deaths. Number one, it was an extremely poor part of the city, a high crime area. One of the things that is widely discussed in a lot of the Jack the Ripper books and stories is that even though it was a high crime area and there was a lot of poverty, murder was not extremely common. Well, it appears that murders definitely did indeed take place. I mean, I just read off several murders and suspicious deaths right there, and prior to Jack the Ripper's reign of terror in the summer and fall of 1888, it's called the Autumn of Terror. The first two crimes actually take place in the summer. Prior to that, there are murders that happen, and it's not abnormal for a certain street in a city, in a poor district, to have more crime than others. It's not abnormal for a certain city block to have more crime than other parts of the city, and that would include crimes like murder. So I'm really not completely convinced that there would have to be some type of connection among these victims. It could just be that they were women who were living in a vulnerable place under vulnerable circumstances, who are staying out late at night, who are just interacting with a lot of dangerous men, and sometimes they're not, it's no fault of their own, where it sounds like with Emily Atkins Horsnall that she was just approached by a group of men and assaulted, and who knows exactly everything that took place and went down that night, but she definitely didn't deserve to be murdered. So when people kind of jump to conclusions with these types of hypothesizing methods, I'm always going to play the skeptical card, but I do approach this with an open mind. It could be completely true that, yeah, there was a serial killer stalking George Street, 18 George Street and 19 George Street. That's possible, but we have to keep the different possibilities open. back to the timeline of Emily Atkins Horsnall. She was born Emily Atkins in Shoreditch, Middlesex, England, and then in 1887, it is reported that she was attacked by multiple men, and she was even questioned about who attacked her, and she said that she did not know them, and it is most likely that this occurred on November 5th of that year, although in a lot of sources there might be a question mark on the exact day when Emily Horsnall was attacked. And then on 1887 as well, Eliza Ryan, the deputy of 19 George Street, finds Emily's body and calls the doctor, Dr. William Dukes of 75 Brick Lane, and pronounces life extinct when he arrives. So that was more or less what happened and the conclusion of Emily's story there. But I think that this is one that also goes to show that people are trying to remember the victims, and even though there aren't sketches and illustrations of Emily Horsnall that are widely shared online, Victorian Whitechapel appears to be a website that is really trying to remember the female victims. And I can even look at one of the descriptions. It's kind of like a subtitle or a header for the website where it says, Victorian Whitechapel is a site that is for Margaret, Dark Annie, Catherine, Emma, Long Liz, Emily, Alice, Polly, Martha, Annie, Frances, Rose, Mary, Ada, Lizzie, and all the women who have lived and were murdered in Whitechapel. May you never be forgotten. And this was also a website that has pointed out that there are books out there that are trying to really tell the stories of the victims. And recently I was talking to you guys about the book The Return of the Ripper by Kevin Turton, and that is one that talks about the murder of Frances Coles. And there was a big reason why I wanted to read that one, because I was just impressed that someone composed an entire book about the murder of Frances Coles. I know she's a possible Jack the Ripper victim, so of course people are going to be looking into her story. But there are numerous books like that out there, and they're trying to add this humanizing element where they recognize that the victims have passed away, and all of their immediate family members have also passed away. The crimes occurred in the late 1800s. So they want to remember the victims and add this type of humanizing element. And one of the books that I was reading was The Seduction of Mary Kelly. And it's actually a 2-volume book. I started volume 1, but it was a novel, and it was one that I just couldn't really get into. I have a lot of trouble when I'm trying to read true crime stories that have been written as a novel, and sometimes they're amazing, other times they are just a little bit difficult to truly explore, because I like to just read nonfiction books. Those I can just spend all day going through. But Victorian Whitechapel has also shared some images of numerous books that have been written about the Ripper victims. And one aspect of this site is it's really trying to show that certain people might choose a particular story from the Whitechapel murders and write an entire book about that, because they're trying to remember the victim, and exactly as it says here, so that they will never be forgotten. And I do commend them for that. And that is actually a Tumblr page, and you can get it at victorianwhitechapel.tumblr.com. Also recommending Richard Jones's article, Emily Horsnail. He uses the spelling Horsnail, and that's available at JackTheRipperTour.com. And there's also a video on the Jack the Ripper Tour YouTube channel, which I watched before this. And I'm going to keep going through the book Ripper Confidential by Tom Westcott, and I'm also going to look at how this is going to tie into his other book, The Bank Holiday Murders. But thank you so much for listening to this episode. I mean, anybody can write the show at blackboxonlineradio@AOL.com. You can also get me on Facebook. My personal Facebook is in the description box. And there's always BlackboxSnid88 over on Instagram. And anybody can support this show at BuyMeACoffee.com. BuyMeACoffee.com, also BlackboxSnid88. There's a link in the description box for that. And anybody who makes a donation will get a shout out on Zodiac Monday. And that's all for me now. And thank you so much once again. And until next time.